Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Fabula and Syuzhet, or Syuzhet. I'm not 100% sure. I was taught when I took lit theory classes to pronounce it Syuzhet, or Syuzhet, sorry. I don't even know. I'm losing it. I'm losing everything. Yeah, I was taught to pronounce it Syuzhet, but Wikipedia pronounces it
Syuzhet.
Syuzhet. So I don't know what it is. I'm going to keep saying Syuzhet because that's what I have said for years. And if you don't like it, then I apologize. So, Fabula and Syuzhet. These are concepts that originate with Russian formalism, which was a movement in really the 1920s, 30s. Basically, Russian formalism was a school that became really interested in the idea that literary techniques are incredibly significant, that the particular bits and pieces of how stories are put together, how artistic works are put together, matter. And they matter in specific formal ways. So Russian formalism was sort of a fellow traveler along with disciplines like linguistics, semiotics, and then structuralism, all of which are really interested in how meaning is made within systems for conveying meaning, like language, like the arts, like literature, poetry, fiction, things like this. So, two of the Russian formalists, Vladimir Prop and Viktor Shklovsky, whose names I may be mispronouncing. If I am, I apologize. I'm going to call them Vlad and Vic. Vlad and Vic came up with this idea that there's a distinction within storytelling between the fabula and the Syuzhet. What they said about the fabula is that it's basically a traditional sort of chronology of the events being depicted, right? So the first thing that occurs, if we think of it not the story as it is written or told, whatever it is, but the story as it occurs for the characters, right? So the first thing that happens, second thing that happens to the character, third thing, fourth thing, fifth thing that happens to the character, etc., right in a straight line from beginning to end. That's the fabula. It is a very sort of literal, traditional conception of temporality within a story. And if you go back to something like Aristotle's Poetics, right, you have Aristotle says that every good story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you put them in that order, beginning, middle, end, you are working basically from the fabula. Now, there's some gray area there. I don't want to sort of say you're telling a fabula-based story, but you may be hewing quite close to the fabula. On the other hand, there is the Syuzhet, and the Syuzhet is the order of events within the story itself. So the order that a narrative gives us the events. And this is not always aligned with the fabula. Sometimes it is aligned quite closely, right? More simplistic narratives, children's stories, for instance, will often start at the beginning and they'll go through the end of a story. That there may be very, very little distinction between the fabula and the Syuzhet in that case. The order of events in the narrative looks a lot like the order of events as it's told by the author, the speaker, whatever it is. On the other hand, especially in modernism and postmodernism, you have a lot of works that radically diverge in the Syuzhet from the Fabula. Time's Arrow by Martin Amis, for instance, the narrative is told backwards. We start from the end and move toward the beginning. Something like Memento, which I think is a Christopher Nolan, I think? You can fact check me if I'm wrong on that. Actually, I'm going to check that real quick. Yeah, Christopher Nolan's Memento. It's a very fragmented narrative. Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. We have temporal jumps back and forward in time. We have sort of the end results of things. Any story that starts en media res. This is a technique we see all the time, especially on in TV shows, where you have a sort of, all right, your character is in some kind of precarious or surprising position, and then the story goes, and then the plot. So precarious or surprising position, usually from the end of the storyline, the chronology. And then the show goes back in time to the beginning and takes us through on a how did we get here type basis. So these are two different approaches to constructing stories. There is, however, also much more sort of subtlety to this distinction, right? Because you think about something, so like, Aristotle says stories should have a beginning, a middle, and end, right? But even stories that seem to have a beginning, middle, and end do not necessarily follow the fabula. You think about something like Sophocles' Oedipus the King, right? We have the events. The play starts with the citizens of Thebes being like, there's a plague. Save us, King Oedipus, you're really smart and know how to deal with a plague. And then it moves forward to the eventual end point where, spoiler alert, Oedipus realizes that he is the cause of the plague because he had inadvertently killed his father and buried his mother, and now he has to pronounce sentence on himself that he should be exiled from Thebes in order to save the city according to the will of the gods. But it's not as simple and straightforward as all that, because what we have in the fabula would be way, way back before this play actually starts. So even though Aristotle would probably say, yes, this has a beginning, middle, end, it's a well-structured story, good job, Sophocles, what we actually have is a distinction, a gap between the fabula and the Syuzhet. Because the fabula would start at the time, at the very least, if not somewhat earlier than this, it would start at the time where Laius gets the prophecy that his son will kill him and marry his wife. And therefore, Laius decides not to ever have kids. That's way before Oedipus the King actually starts in Sophocles' version, but it's part of the requisite storyline, right? We need that information, but we get that information within the Oedipus the King storyline because people tell us, oh yeah, back in the day, these things happened. The same thing with Oedipus being sort of cast out by Laius and Jocasta after his birth. The same thing with him going to Corinth, going from Corinth to the oracle at Delphi and getting the prophecy, and then leaving Corinth and all this stuff. All of these things, none of them happen in the actual structure of Oedipus the King. They are narrated to us. And so what we have there is the gap between the fabula and the Syuzhet. Because if we were doing this fabula style, we would have to start at the very latest with Laius getting that prophecy deciding not to have kids, then getting drunk, having sex with Jocasta, having Oedipus, and then casting him out, etc., etc. All of that stuff would have to be first, because chronologically it comes first in the world that the characters inhabit. So this is one of those things, like, it's a really important sort of analytical tool, but being aware of the distinction between Fabula and Syuzhet can also help you as a writer. It can help you as a writer sort of decide how to structure a narrative most effectively. Because if you have a sort of awareness of the chronology of the characters within the world that they inhabit, you can decide what are the best ways of giving the audience crumbs, clues, indications of where the story is going, without necessarily starting and sort of simply giving us a chronology, because chronologies are often quite boring. They're not artistic. The Fabula, to a certain extent, is a non-artistic mode, whereas the Syuzhet, because it is constructed in order to achieve certain artistic purposes, is inherently artistic. So the use of things like flashbacks, like temporal jumps, in media res, all of these kinds of techniques can help build the artistic strength of a work. And so if you consider, and it's worth doing, especially with things like novels, full-length plays, full-length films, things like this, larger scale works, storyboarding, right? You storyboard, you set things up, and then sort of trace out the events and decide how you want to slot them into the storyline, which is not, again, necessarily going to be chronological, but will achieve particular impacts on the audience.